port today. Typical supply chain. Every single activity in this supply chain is a very big user of land. Inland terminal drivers, the first one is profit. Profit for the port, profit for everybody in the supply chain. Second, compress the supply chain for time and cost. Third, lack of land, lack of capacity for growth at the port. Then you get to the social, ecological, political constraints, congestion and contamination, the reduction thereof, deeper penetration into the hinterland, and it's all about time, reliability, and price, and it's about that particular supply chain competing with the other supply chains, as Jose Luis has stated. These ports, Panama is a perfect example. Panama 15 years ago was just a canal. Today it's a major maritime transport hub. It's filling a need, it's filling a niche. And many of the ports today are not looking at this. They're looking at this as simply as a sea-land interface, and it's no longer the case. It will no longer work. Functions, same as in English and Spanish, Chinese, they were covered already. Types and functions of dry ports, you got a satellite terminal, a load center, or transshipment. And here's a sea-land interface, drayage. And then from there, you start going into satellite centers or transshipment centers, and they go either direct or end haul through trucks, rail. The business model for an inland terminal is the intermodal operator, which typically is not the owner or should not be the owner, because that operator is better served putting their assets in their core business rather than into a real estate investment. The second one is a real estate developer. We were the real estate consultants on 2 intermodal facilities. Each one is about $350, $400 million. The owner is a pension fund. And this pension fund originally wanted to build very large box retail centers. And they had no idea. In fact, when they called me, they asked, we want you to explain 2 things. One is, what is intermodal and how do you spell it? They had no idea. And I said, well, why are you asking? Because we have a site that's adjacent to what they're telling us is going to be 1.5 million TEU terminal. We haven't figured out what TEU means yet. And then on the other side, there's this very large rail yard which hasn't been used in 20 years, which we wanted to buy to create a big Walmart building. And I'm thinking to myself, at this particular port, the biggest challenge was a lack of intermodal capability. And here they're sitting between a very large unused rail yard and a brand new container terminal. It was a perfect strategic fit. We showed them how much money they could make. Their eyes came out of their head. They said, this is a lot better than a Walmart. And the challenge for us was, how do you analyze this from the perspective of a port within a port? Because they were going to be landlords only, not operators. The keys to intermodal facilities and inland terminals, it's really all about compressing the supply chain. Ports are, in many cases, the weak link in that supply chain. We used to talk about just-in-time. That's no longer the case. After 2002 and the work stoppage on the West Coast, shippers wanted to diversify and make sure that they've got several supply chains going. So that's shifted to integrated time. And integrated time means a very integrated supply chain. So from a port's perspective, which link do you want your port to be? This or this? And that is handled in the background. Now, from an infrastructure standpoint, the OECD estimates that $70 trillion will be needed for infrastructure development by the year 2030. 70 trillion in the world. The average size of an infrastructure investment fund is now only about $3.5 billion. Well, considering that you need 70 trillion, we're not getting very far very quickly. By next year, there's going to be about 100 billion allocated to port and port-related infrastructure investment. Now, my position is that ports need to start accessing this capital to create competitive advantages for themselves. And this includes inland ports and dry ports in the interior. Global demand forecast, by 2015 over 220 million TEU, but port capacity is only at 107 million TEU. Again, we got to do something about throughput and velocity. From an infrastructure investor's perspective, everybody thinks that most of the ports have been privatized. That's not the case, especially when you start seeing the larger ports. And this is what investors look at: low, medium, high risk. Seaports sit in the middle, but in a very interesting fashion, because their internal rates of return are almost as high, sometimes can be just as high, as high-risk investments, and they also offer capital appreciation potential. Ports need to start thinking along these lines to attract these kinds of investors. So the opportunities from a port standpoint for intermodal facilities are, first and foremost, maximization of the port's value, increasing its capacity and capability of processing cargo, also addressing a lack of current leadership. If you go into the logistics industry, nobody needs to tell the logistics industry how to run it. It's a very efficient industry with tremendous amount of leadership capability. But if you go to the transport side of things, it's very fragmented and balkanized. One mode doesn't talk to the other, and the leadership stays within each segment. But there's not an overall vision or leadership being given. And to me, the natural leader to step in and fill that vacuum is a port authority. Now, from a port authority standpoint, a port authority is no different than a shopping center, like the shopping center right down this hill. It's a center of distribution. The port's business is trying to charge as much rent as they possibly can. They do that by making sure their clients are as successful as they possibly can. So if a port expands that sphere of influence out into the hinterland by 100, 200, 300 kilometers, it might look like they're taking on a role that doesn't directly impact them, but it does. More throughput over that quayside. And this is my conclusion. The way to grow your port is not only inland, but inland. Thank you very much.